To wrap up this series on why did they cheat, from a neurobiological perspective, I'd like to share just a few more thoughts. I mean, obviously this isn't comprehensive, but I do think it at least helps us look at this maybe from a little different perspective. Now, let me say, whether it's addiction or biological, it is not an excuse. I can say that 100 times. The fact is, you have to set yourself up to get to this place, but at least maybe you can understand some of the difficulties, and I'm going to offer maybe a couple of things you can do to help break out of this. One other aspect of addiction that's interesting, and something that we think is going to work, which is just willpower. It's called ego fatigue. We sit there and say, okay, I'm just not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. And the problem with just focusing on not doing it is it flat doesn't work. What scientists call ego fatigue really reflects a disconnect between the bridge of the ship, the prefrontal cortex, the logical part of us, the piece that has the long-term goals, is rational, reasonable, and the motivational engines in that striatum that we've talked about in earlier videos. Roy Baumeister collected the earliest evidence of what we call ego fatigue in a study published in 1998. And what he did was he brought, the control subjects into the lab. They weren't supposed to eat before they came, so they'd be hungry. And he put a jar of cookies in front of half the group and a jar of radishes in front of another. And the people with the jar of cookies were told they could eat as many cookies as they want, and the people in front of the radishes were told they could eat as many radishes as they want, but they could not have any cookies. And what happened is they began to follow up with this. Afterwards, they were given tasks that required self-control and willpower just to keep doing it. And the people who weren't allowed to eat the cookies didn't perform nearly as well as those who were able to eat the cookies, because they had used that self-control, that willpower to keep from doing that, and so they really weren't able to sustain other tasks that required willpower. So with this study, he showed that self-control and sustained effort really kind of led to people giving up sooner if they had already been having to do that. Michael Ainslie at the University of Toronto kind of proposed that people stop trying simply because frustration builds up and they let go. It's not a fact that they've used up the brain chemicals that are necessary for willpower, but it's the frustration of trying to override the striatum, and that motivational engine is just pumping, saying you've got to do this, and they keep fighting, and eventually in frustration they stop. And Ainslie's research also revealed that when people were trying to avoid making mistakes, they became weaker with ego fatigue, but only when, and it's only in certain circumstances, they were trying to suppress their feelings. So when they weren't being open and real about what's going on. Other kinds of emotional control, like reinterpreting the emotional events, really didn't cause any sort of ego fatigue. So one of the lessons they've learned is when we're trying so hard not to think about a pink elephant and we keep resisting it, which is often the approach, people even tell addicts, just say no. That's going to be the way out of it, but the research shows that's not the way out of it at all. Other issues have to be addressed in order for them to move forward. And one of the things they've shown is that being able to create a coherent past to present to future story, a narrative in people's lives, are the things that begin for addicts and people in limerence to get them really back on track. One more little piece of research that I find really interesting, Michael Chandler and his associates at the University of British Columbia did a study on Native communities in Western Canada. And what they discovered is that the teen suicide rates in these tribal councils was actually 500% to 800% higher than the national average. But as they began to talk to these kids and figure things out, further analysis revealed that the suicide rates among the 29 councils varied greatly. 6 of the tribal councils had 0 suicides, while some of the others had suicide rates as high as 633 suicides per 100,000. What was the difference between those teens that had nothing to live for and those who had nothing to die for? Well, as they began to get the stories and talk to these teenagers, they found that in high suicide communities, they did not have a narrative, a story to tell. They had no clear sense of their past, their childhood, the generation preceding them, really nothing to live for. While those that had no suicides had a strong life story, a narrative. Tribal elders had preserved all of the language and the customs of the tribe, and they had identity, they had meaning. And those teens saw themselves as part of a much larger narrative. Their lives were actually meaningful. High suicide communities, however, had lost culture and rituals, and life just didn't make sense to them. And so they're like on this island, and they would be at McDonald's, or they'd be using drugs, but they really had nothing to live for, no larger purpose. Richard Rohr, in a study done of primal rites of initiation, showed that with teenagers, and believe it, this applies to this whole addiction piece and limerent piece, but he showed that almost across the board, regardless of the country, the same 5 messages were given or taught to their children so that they would be successful in life, so they would have meaning and they'd have purpose. The first one is life is hard. That, they wanted their kids to understand it, that we go through hard things and we do well. And the 2 was, life's not about you. You're supposed to be about life. You have a bigger purpose than just you, which is reinforced by the 3rd message, which is you're not that important. And the 4th message was you're not even in control. You need to, go with what life brings. Don't try to manage everything. And the 5th message was you're going to die. Because once they could accept they're going to die, they were able in some ways to actually live because they're not trying to avoid dying. They could give themselves to a bigger cause. And what's happening with these teens where there was no suicide is they ultimately had purpose and meaning, and life wasn't just about their happiness. Humans, we need to see our lives progressing from a meaningful past to a viable future. We need to feel that we're somehow going somewhere. However, once the motivational engines in that striatum take over, and now we've got this incredible craving to pursue short-term goals, short-term pleasure that comes either from a relationship or from cocaine or from alcohol, we lose the ability to even see our life in a larger narrative, because now that addictive pursuit of the immediate reward or that limerent pursuit, it locks them into just a small life, void of richness of either their past and of a viable future. It's dead because it's lost its connection from the story from which it came. I see it all the time in limerence. It's like people, whatever was important to them in the past, they're now ready to completely jettison. It has no meaning to them. And the only future they can see is that happiness that comes, and it's really what the striatum is telling them, along with the nucleus accumbens, if you remember, along with the orbital frontal cortex, along with the amygdala. It's like they can only pursue that one thing, and everything in life as they go forward is all associated with pleasure. I deserve to be happy, right? But it's all short-term goals, all low-hanging fruit. So their lives are driven by the nucleus of that accumbens in redundant cycles, void of insight, perspective, and the higher order goals provided by the prefrontal cortex. Like I said earlier, it's like the bridge of the ship. Because of that addiction, because of what's happened unconsciously in the striatum, as it's produced, this desire to get this thing that it's decided is pleasurable. It's created that synaptic network. Literally, the bridge of the ship is disconnected from the motivational engines. So let me offer some solutions from a neurobiological perspective. Part of what has to happen is a shift in desire. Now, you can't change desire so easily. A lot of times it takes a bounce, it takes hitting bottom, it takes a crisis where the pain outweighs the benefit of whatever they're doing, where the dopamine that's being created by the striatum, suddenly there's so much pain and you suddenly have this moment, you go, is that all there is? And at that moment, there is a chance to try to reconnect the motivational engine, the bridge of the ship, back with, that striatum, the motivational engine, where, there's perspective and higher order goals. And once again, this part of the brain can play the part it was intended to play. The trick to overcoming addiction is thus a realigning of desires so that it switches from the goal of just immediate relief to a goal of long-term fulfillment, of meaning, of purpose. Addictions can only be beaten, I think, or limerence, or whatever, by that alignment of desires with a personally derived, future-oriented goals, where they see life as something bigger than them. Remember, life is hard. Okay, it's not just about feeling good. Life's not about you. You're supposed to be about life. Really, it's not all about you. You're not that important. You're not in control. Let go of control to gain control. And find what brings meaning and purpose. If you know addicts in recovery, and I know so many people who've broken out of limit relationships, their life has new meaning and new purpose. They've found goals that are bigger than them, things they can begin to live for. When desire is ready to arc from the goal of immediate relief to the goal of a valued future, treatment begins. But not by inducing desire. Only frustration and suffering do that. But by capturing and holding one's vision of a very different future, where you begin to see that just the immediate gratification that comes from the short-term goal, that there's something more. But you have to get reconnected back. It reminds me of a person I was talking to a few years back. They were in a limit relationship, couldn't figure out what the heck to do. And, they just knew that anything other than being with this person, life to them seemed totally miserable. But also when I talk about your life becomes very small, it's like he no longer had a sense of anything other than the dilemma he was in between his mate and his affair partner. And so I asked the guy, who has been really influential in your life? Who helped shape you? Who are the people in your life that you really respect? And, he kind of laughed and he said, well, there's probably a couple of people. One would be my grandfather. He said he showed me so many things. And another would be this professor who had mentored him. And he talked about both of their lives and what an incredible example they had been to him and how they had included him and let him be a part of their lives. And you could just see him changing as he talked about the story. And then I said to him, so what advice do you think these men would give you if they could write you a letter from the grave about where you're at and what you're doing and what they would suggest? And the guy just goes silent. And I said, what I just did was created this collision of what's going on up in your striatum, this craving just to be with this other person and jettison everything you've ever been in life, because you're certainly not you. And he agreed with that. I've created a collision between that and perspective. And now you've got perspective. And he said, but that doesn't kill the desire. And I said, right. New long-term goals, reconnecting with who you really are, that doesn't change everything because it's a battle. But you do have to have something out in front of you that will draw you, a reason to begin to do this. And if you go back and begin to study that, and we can figure out what are the feelings inside that have caused all of this to even begin with. I mean, how then can you live? How can you do it differently as you go forward? Once he got involved with other people who were like-minded, who could remind him, slowly but surely, the bridge of the ship was reconnected. And he broke out of that thing. But it wasn't just by trying not to do it. It literally was by focusing on something bigger and finding others to come along beside him. And that type of group work, that type of support, whether addictions again or, infatuation in relationships, is critical. That's why AA, Celebrate Recovery, counselors can be really useful in helping reconnect and figure out what trauma may be driving and things like that. They can help you stay that course. But I will say from today's thing, it's not just about don't do it. It's going to be about building a better life to healing.